"You are fired," says the arrogant millionaire CEO to the poor nanny, until 9 men in 5 black SUVs showed up for the nanny. Asher, the arrogant millionaire CEO, turned into his driveway and slowed. 5 black SUVs stood where his view of the ocean used to be. Engines idled, doors opened. Men stepped out and spread across the stone drive with quiet precision. Asher cut the engine. Then he saw her. Martha stood at the front door, hands folded, watching him arrive. She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. She was already where she needed to be. To understand what led to this, let's start from the beginning. At 4:30 a.m., the house obeyed. Lights adjusted themselves in soft gradients. Climate controls recalibrated. The silence held, not the absence of sound, but the engineered kind, the kind that cost money, the kind that meant no neighbors, no traffic, no reminders that the world beyond the glass still existed. Asher Thorne opened his eyes before the alarm. He always did. There was no grogginess, no hesitation. Sleep was a transaction to him. Necessary, limited, optimized. He swung his legs out of bed and stood, already mentally stepping through the day's objectives. By the time he entered his office, the monitors were waking up, just as he'd designed them to. Blue light spilled across the walls, reflected in the polished steel accents, the marble floor, the glass desk that never held clutter because clutter implied inefficiency. Markets first, always markets. The Nikkei scrolled smoothly. The FTSE followed. Futures aligned closely enough to projections that Asher felt the faint, controlled satisfaction of a system performing as expected. Then, without shifting his posture, he glanced left. The nursery feed came up automatically. Leo lay sprawled diagonally across his bed, one sock missing, hair flattened on one side. Maya slept curled inward, rabbit tucked under her chin, chest rising in shallow, even breaths. Asher leaned forward slightly. He didn't smile. He adjusted the zoom. "Stillness," he murmured. "Acceptable." He brought up the progress portal. The interface responded instantly. No lag. He'd paid extra for that. Leo. Mandarin tonal accuracy, 82%. Projection, 87%. Pattern recognition drills, plateauing. Emotional variance index, elevated during evening hours. Maya. Violin posture, inconsistent. Focus duration, below benchmark. Attachment response, irregular. Asher tapped his stylus against the desk. Irregular. He disliked that word. It implied variables he hadn't accounted for. "Growth metrics are stagnant," he said aloud, as if the room itself were responsible. Behind him, the door opened. Martha moved with practiced quiet, her steps measured, her breathing steady. She carried the coffee tray with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because she had learned that precision mattered in this house. She placed the cup exactly where Asher expected it to be. "You're late," he said. "By 2 minutes," she replied. The boiler hesitated. Asher didn't turn right away. He finished reading the line item on Leo's latest assessment. "And I reset the pilot." He turned then. "In this house," he said calmly, "we don't reset." Martha met his eyes. "We replace," she finished. Asher nodded once. Approval, not gratitude. "See that it doesn't happen again." She inclined her head. "Yes, sir." Her gaze drifted, unintentionally she would later claim, to the photograph on his desk. Sarah, barefoot on a beach, sunlight caught in her hair, laughing at something outside the frame. Asher followed Martha's eyes. He reached out and turned the frame face down. The click of glass against wood sounded louder than it should have. "The world is a scoreboard," he said, more to himself than to her. "And I'm currently the only one in this house putting points on it." Martha hesitated. "The children," she began. "They're assets," Asher said flatly. "With potential. Potential requires pressure." Silence settled between them. "Wake them," he said. "Logic drills at 6. Martha nodded and left. Asher sipped his coffee. Perfect temperature. On the screen, Leo stirred. Asher didn't notice. Breakfast in the Thorne house was not a meal. It was a checkpoint. Leo sat straight backed at the long dining table, feet dangling just above the marble floor. Maya swung her legs gently, humming to herself until Asher cleared his throat. She stopped immediately. "Good morning," Asher said. "Good morning, Daddy," Leo replied, voice careful. Maya echoed him a second later, slightly out of sync. Asher noticed. He always noticed. "Leo," Asher said, "recite yesterday's Mandarin vocabulary." Leo swallowed and began. His pronunciation was good, not perfect. Asher's brow furrowed. "Tone 4, he corrected sharply. Again. Leo tried again. Better. Maya reached for her rabbit. "No toys at the table," Asher said without looking. Maya froze, then slowly set the rabbit down. Martha stood near the wall, hands clasped, watching everything without appearing to. Asher finished his coffee. "You have violin at 7, he told Maya. "I expect improvement." "Yes, Daddy." "And Leo," he continued, "no more hesitation in logic drills. Confidence matters." "Yes, sir." "Sir." The word pleased him more than it should have. By noon, the house smelled wrong. Lavender, Sarah's lavender, was being erased. A cleaning crew moved efficiently through the halls, wiping surfaces, replacing linens, neutralizing anything that hinted at softness. Michelle arrived just after 12. She wore white, always white. Sharp lines, minimal jewelry. She looked like the future Asher imagined for himself. "This place has potential," she said, walking beside him through the foyer. "But it's sentimental." She gestured toward the playroom. The mural. Planets in imperfect orbits, stars too bright, a sun that smiled. Michelle wrinkled her nose. "It feels like a museum." Asher nodded. "We'll gut it." "White marble," she said. "Minimalist." "Agreed." Martha appeared at the edge of the hall. "Martha," Asher called. "Come here." She approached. Asher handed her the envelope. "You've been loyal," he said, "but you're outdated. The children need new input." Martha looked at the envelope, then at him. "You haven't read the trust bylaws," she said quietly. Asher laughed. "I own this house." He dropped the envelope at her feet. "Be gone by tomorrow." "You're fired." Martha didn't move. "I hope," she said softly, "that one day you understand the difference between ownership and stewardship." Asher turned away. Behind him, Martha bent slowly and picked up the envelope. Her face was calm. Her eyes were not. Thorne Tower had always announced Asher's arrival, not with signs or ceremony, but with movement. Analysts straightened. Assistants lowered their voices. Conversations bent themselves around his stride, as if pulled by gravity. The building had learned him over decades, calibrated itself to his presence the way a machine learned a user's fingerprints. That morning, it didn't. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor, and nothing happened. No greetings, no footsteps rushing forward, no subtle clearing of throats, just silence. Asher stepped out anyway, briefcase in hand, posture unchanged. He walked past the glass-walled offices, noticing, too late, that people were looking down at their desks, not up at him. Tablets glowed in front of them. Screens reflected pale light across faces that looked strained. He reached the boardroom doors. They were already open. The entire executive team sat around the long mahogany table. Laptops open, tablets in hand. No one spoke. Asher stopped just inside the doorway. "What is this?" he asked. No one answered immediately. He walked to his seat at the head of the table and placed his briefcase down with controlled force. "I asked a question." The CFO finally looked up. His face was pale, not nervous pale, but emptied, as if something had been drained out of him. "Asher," he said slowly, "we have a situation." Asher sat. "Then summarize it." "We're already behind schedule." The CFO glanced at the others, then back down at his tablet. "There was a flash sell," he said, "early this morning. 40% of Class A voting shares." Asher didn't blink. "That's impossible." "It's not." the CFO replied. It already happened. Asher leaned back slightly, folding his hands. I hold the majority. Those shares can't move without my authorization. They weren't yours, the CFO said. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls had inched inward. What do you mean they weren't mine? Asher asked. They were held through a subsidiary, the CFO continued. One honestly, we didn't think was operational anymore. Asher's jaw tightened. Which subsidiary? The CFO swallowed. The Aurelia Trust. The name hung in the air like dust. Asher laughed. He couldn't help it. That's absurd. That trust is a legal corpse. I've had attorneys dismantling it for years. Apparently, the CFO said quietly, it wasn't dismantled. It was waiting. Asher's phone vibrated on the table. He ignored it. Explain, he said. The trust executed a liquidation clause, the CFO continued. Perfectly legal, perfectly timed. The shares were sold, consolidated, and restructured within minutes. Asher's phone vibrated again. This time, he picked it up. Breaking news. Thorne Industries taken private in hostile overtake. CEO Asher Thorne removed. The words didn't register immediately. He read them again. Then again. Removed. That's fake, Asher said. No, the CFO replied. It's already filed. Asher stood so abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor. This is my company, he said. I built it. Two men stepped into the room. They weren't security, Asher recognized. They wore dark suits, no insignia, expressions professionally neutral. Mr. Thorne, one said, your access to this building has been revoked. Asher stared at him. Do you know who I am? Yes, sir, the man replied. You're trespassing. The word struck like a slap. Get out of my way, Asher snapped. The men didn't move. They didn't need to. Asher felt it then. Not fear, not yet, but displacement. Like stepping into a room that had been rearranged while he wasn't looking. He was escorted out, past offices that didn't look up, past assistants who pretended to type, past glass walls that reflected a man already becoming irrelevant. At the lobby, his keycard failed. His thumbprint didn't register. The doors opened only when the guards activated them, and then they closed, behind him. Asher drove himself. He always had. Drivers were inefficient. Schedules slipped. Privacy eroded. His Italian sports car purred beneath him as he pulled into traffic, muscle memory. Guiding his hands while his mind raced ahead, trying to outrun the implications. This was a misunderstanding. A legal knot. A technicality. It would be undone. He tapped the voice command. Call legal. A pause. I'm sorry, the car's AI replied. This service is no longer active. Asher frowned. Call Michelle. The call rang once, then went to voicemail. Call private banking. The line disconnected before it rang. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched ahead of him, ocean flashing blue on his right, cliffs dropping away sharply. Normally the view grounded him, reminded him of scale. Today, it mocked him. He pulled over abruptly, tires crunching against gravel. He opened his banking app. Balance, $0. Status, frozen by trustee. Asher stared at the screen. He refreshed it. Same result. A cold sweat crept along his spine. This wasn't a glitch. This was execution. His phone chimed. Unknown number. The performance review concludes at 3 p.m. Please be home for the final assessment. Asher checked the dashboard clock. 2:55 p.m. Son of a... He floored the accelerator. The car surged forward, hugging the road as if it too sensed urgency. 40 miles. 40 miles to his house. 40 miles to something he hadn't yet understood, but could already feel tightening around him. When Asher reached the estate, the gates opened automatically. That, at least, still worked. The house stood exactly as it always had, angular, reflective, immaculate, a monument to precision. Asher burst through the front doors. Martha, he called. No answer. The house felt wrong. not empty, quietly observant. He moved through the halls quickly, calling her name, then the children's. Nothing. He stopped at the door to the basement utility corridor. He hadn't been down there in years. The door was locked, not with a standard lock, with a biometric scanner. Asher stared at it. "That's not possible," he muttered. He pressed his thumb against it. Denied. His pulse spiked. He stepped back and rammed his shoulder into the door. Once, twice. On the third hit, the frame splintered. The door gave way. Inside was not a utility closet. It was a command center. Monitors lined the walls. 6 of them, all live. Every room in the house. Financial dashboards, security feeds, and one screen tracking a single blinking dot, his GPS location. Asher staggered forward. On the desk sat a tape recorder. Old. Analog. A note lay beside it. For when you finally stop looking at the numbers, the handwriting was unmistakable. Sarah. His hands shook as he pressed play. Her voice filled the room. Not angry. Tired. "Asher," she said, "if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone. And you've become the man I was afraid you'd become." Asher closed his eyes. "You didn't love me," Sarah continued. "You managed me, and I won't let you manage our children into the ground." Martha appeared on one of the screens, moving calmly through the kitchen. "Martha isn't just a nanny," Sarah said. "She's the executor. She's been watching, documenting. Every choice you made when you thought no one was looking." Asher's breath came shallow. "This house," Sarah said, "the company, none of it was ever yours. It was a loan. And today the loan is due." The tape clicked off. Asher stood frozen. Then he laughed. A broken sound. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He stumbled back upstairs. Michelle was in the living room, packing. Designer bags lay open across the floor. Jewelry cases snapped shut. Relief surged through Asher. "Michelle," he said, "thank God. We need to call the police." "Martha." Michelle looked at him. Her expression wasn't surprised. It was resigned. "I already spoke to the lawyers," she said. "The trust is airtight." Asher's mouth went dry. "This is theft," he said. "She stole everything." "No," Michelle replied. "She reclaimed it." She held up a bottle. Protocol 9. Asher recognized it immediately. Sarah's medication. "You pushed her to take this," Michelle said. "You told her she had to recover faster. That rest was inefficient." "That's not—" "You didn't kill her with a weapon," Michelle interrupted. "You killed her with expectations." The words landed heavier than the loss of money. Michelle zipped her bag. "I'm not staying," she said. "I don't do bankruptcies." She walked past him without another glance. Asher sank into the couch. For the first time, there was no system to optimize, only memory. Asher sat alone in the living room long after Michelle left. The house didn't comfort him. It observed. The walls reflected his shape back at him from too many angles, fractured, distorted. Glass had always felt honest to Asher. It didn't lie. It showed you exactly what was there. Now it showed him a man slumped forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped as if in prayer to something he didn't believe in. He stood abruptly. "Leo," he called. "Maya," his voice echoed. Nothing answered. He moved through the house again, slower this time, checking rooms he'd never bothered to enter before. The playroom. The reading nook Sarah had insisted on. The small art corner, where Maya's drawings still lay stacked neatly in a tray, untouched. He paused. Picked one up. Crayon scribbles. A house. 2 small figures. A large shape off to the side, colored dark blue, standing apart. Asher frowned. He set the drawing down carefully, as if it might accuse him. His phone buzzed. No caller ID. He answered. "Asher," Martha said calmly. His grip tightened. "Where are my children?" "They're safe." "That's not your decision." There was a brief silence on the line. "It is now," Martha replied. Asher stood very still. "You think you've won," he said. "You think you're clever. This ends badly for you." Martha sighed, not with fear, but fatigue. You never understood power, she said. You only understood leverage. The call ended. Before we dive deeper, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you. Back to the story. Asher hurled the phone across the room. It shattered against the glass wall, spiderweb cracks spreading outward. For the first time, the house looked fragile. Asher returned to the basement. The command center waited. The monitors flickered softly, cycling through rooms. The nursery feed showed Leo and Maya playing quietly on the floor. A woman, Asher didn't recognize, sitting nearby, reading to them in a low voice. Relief hit him so suddenly it made his knees weak. They're alive, he whispered. Then, anger followed. He moved to the desk and pulled open drawers. Files, physical files, binders, dates, notes, charts, 3 years' worth. Asher flipped through them rapidly at first, then slower as realization set in. Every outburst, every cold dismissal, every missed recital, missed birthday, missed bedtime, logged, time-stamped, quantified, cortisol spike, paternal presence, elevated anxiety response, withdrawal behavior after interaction. Asher's mouth went dry. This wasn't sabotage. It was documentation. He slammed the binder shut and grabbed another. Financials. The Aurelia Trust hadn't been dormant. It had been watching, investing quietly, consolidating assets, preparing contingencies. Sarah's handwriting appeared again, in the margins. If you're reading this, it means you still believe control equals care. Asher ripped the page out. No, he said aloud. This is manipulation. But the room didn't argue. It only displayed. Night fell. Asher didn't notice at first. He sat on the basement floor, back against the wall, staring at the blank monitor where Sarah's message had ended. His mind tried to do what it always did. Solve, reframe, reclaim leverage, identify weaknesses. But memories kept intruding. Sarah standing in the kitchen, pale, asking if they could skip the gala. Sarah sitting on the edge of the bed, exhausted, saying she just needed a day. Sarah smiling anyway when he told her it would all be worth it. He'd called it motivation. He'd called it efficiency. Asher pressed his palms against his eyes. I was building something, he said to the empty room. No one answered. The sound came from above. Engines, multiple. Asher froze. He stood and moved upstairs, heart pounding now, not from fear, but from anticipation, conflict, negotiation. These were arenas he knew. He reached the front windows just as the vehicles pulled into the drive. 5 black SUVs. They moved in practiced formation, tires crunching against gravel, stopping in a clean arc before the entrance. Men stepped out, not police, not corporate security. They wore suits, identical, neutral. And then, Martha. She stepped out last. She wasn't wearing an apron. She wore a charcoal suit, tailored, understated, expensive in a way that didn't announce itself. Her posture was straight, her expression composed. Asher's stomach twisted. He stormed outside. Get off my property, he shouted. Martha didn't flinch. Mr. Thorne, she said evenly, you are under the mistaken belief that ownership is permanent. I'll have you arrested, Asher snarled. You stole my children, my company. You were a temporary manager, Martha replied. And your performance has been evaluated. Asher laughed. By who? By the only person who ever understood you, she said. Sarah. The guards moved forward. Asher backed away. You don't have the authority. Yes, Martha said quietly. I do. They stood in the foyer. Asher felt suddenly small inside the vastness he'd once been proud of. What is this? He demanded. A coup? Martha shook her head. A safeguard. She held up a tablet. Sarah anticipated you'd attempt to dismantle a traditional will, she said. So she structured the trust differently. You were never an owner. Asher stared at the screen. Your continued access to wealth, property, and parental authority, Martha continued, was contingent upon one condition. She paused. The emotional well-being of the heirs. Asher's throat tightened. That's subjective, he snapped. You can't measure. We did, Martha said. She tapped the screen. Charts appeared. Heart rates, stress responses, audio logs. Leo whispering, "Don't make Daddy mad." Maya flinching when footsteps approached. Asher staggered backward. "This is surveillance," he said weakly. "This is accountability," Martha replied. She looked at him, not with triumph, but with something closer to sorrow. "You failed," she said. The words landed heavier than any blow. Michelle appeared at the edge of the foyer, suitcase in hand. She moved quickly, eyes darting toward the exit. One of the guards stepped in her path. Martha turned. "Leave the jewelry," she said calmly. "It was purchased with trust funds." Michelle screamed. Asher watched, helpless. As Michelle was escorted out, her cries faded into the night. Asher turned back to Martha. "I'm their father," he said hoarsely. "You're their lesson," Martha replied. She nodded toward the stairs. "They're upstairs." Asher ran. The nursery was warm. Soft yellow light replaced the clinical blue he'd insisted on. Leo and Maya stood near the window. Asher pressed his hands against the glass. "Leo," he pleaded. "Maya." They looked at him. No anger, no tears, just curiosity. Then Leo reached out and drew the heavy curtain closed. The sound was soft, final. Asher slid down the wall, his reflection warping in the glass. He understood then. Punishment hadn't come as pain. It had come as absence. Asher remained on the floor long after the curtain closed. He didn't know how much time passed. Minutes, maybe, or hours. The house no longer offered him cues. The lighting stayed warm and steady, unresponsive to his presence. The climate didn't adjust. No system acknowledged him. For the first time since he'd commissioned the place, the house behaved as if he were a guest. Or worse, an absence. He pushed himself upright, joints stiff, and stood in the nursery doorway. The room smelled different now. Not antiseptic, not neutral. Lavender, Sarah's lavender. His chest tightened. He took a step forward. "Sir," a voice said gently behind him. Asher turned. One of the trust's guards stood several feet away, hands visible, posture non-threatening. "The children are no longer authorized for contact," the man said. "Please step away from the door." Asher laughed weakly. Authorized. The guard didn't respond. Asher backed out slowly, the weight of the moment settling on him with brutal clarity. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't leverage. This was removal. They escorted him to the study. Not his office, the office. The one Michelle had never liked. The one Sarah used to sit in when she wanted quiet. Martha waited inside. She gestured to the chair across from the desk. "Sit," she said. Asher didn't move. "I'm not signing anything," he said. Martha nodded. "That's your choice." She slid a stack of documents forward anyway. Eviction notice, asset forfeiture acknowledgement, parental suspension order, non-disparagement clauses, travel restrictions. The language was clean, surgical. "You've already frozen my accounts," Asher said. "You've taken my company. What's left?" Martha folded her hands. "Dignity," she said. "If you choose to keep it." Asher's laugh broke. "You think this is dignity?" "No," Martha replied. "I think this is consequence." She tapped one page. "You have 2 hours to vacate the property. You may take personal effects that were purchased prior to your marriage, excluding items acquired through trust leverage, which is..." "Very little," Martha said gently. Asher sank into the chair. He scanned the list. The watch? No. The cars? No. The art? No. The furniture? No. He stopped reading. "Sarah planned this," he whispered. Martha's expression softened, not with sympathy, but with truth. "She planned for this," she said. "She hoped it wouldn't be necessary." Asher returned to the bedroom, the master bedroom. It looked untouched. The bed perfectly made. The surfaces clear. Michelle had taken her things. Sarah's side of the closet remained, clothes he'd never bothered to remove, dresses in muted colors, scarves folded neatly, shoes lined in pairs. Asher stood there, unmoving. He reached out and touched one of the scarves. Soft. He'd never noticed that before. He pulled a battered suitcase from the back of the closet, one he hadn't used in years. He began to pack. He threw in clothes at random. A sweater, shirts he didn't remember buying, a book Sarah had once insisted he read. He stopped when he reached the drawer. The watch, the one he wore to every meeting, the one that signaled status before he spoke. He hesitated, then closed the drawer. He didn't deserve it. Martha met him in the hallway. "You're allowed a final walkthrough," she said. Asher nodded. They walked the house together. The living room, the kitchen, the terrace overlooking the ocean. The sun was setting, throwing gold across the glass walls. The cliffs glowed. The water shimmered. "It's beautiful," Asher said quietly. "Yes," Martha replied. "It always was." They stopped near the playroom. Workers had already begun dismantling the mural. White marble samples lay stacked nearby. Asher watched as a man scraped away a painted star. "Stop," he said suddenly. The worker looked at Martha. She shook her head. "Continue." The star disappeared. Asher closed his eyes. They returned to the foyer. 2 guards waited. Martha handed Asher a final document. "This outlines your terms," she said. "Compliance ensures minimal disruption." "And if I don't comply?" Asher asked. Martha met his gaze steadily. "Then we escalate," she said. "And the children will know you as the man who made it harder." That did it. Asher signed. His hand shook. As the guards prepared to escort him out, Asher turned back to Martha. "You think this makes you righteous," he said bitterly. "You think you're better than me." Martha considered him. "I don't think about you that way," she said. "I think about the children." Asher scoffed. "You'll raise them to hate me." "No," Martha replied. "We'll raise them without fear." The words cut deeper than anything else she could have said. The front doors opened. Cold air rushed in from outside. Asher stepped onto the portico. He turned one last time. The house stood behind him, glass and steel catching the last light of day. Inside, movement continued. Life went on. The doors closed. Not dramatically, just firmly, locked. A single yellow taxi idled at the end of the drive. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't impressive. It was available. Asher walked toward it, suitcase dragging slightly behind him. Each step felt heavier than the last. He paused halfway down the drive, looked back. A light flickered on in the nursery. Warm, steady. He swallowed, then kept walking. The taxi smelled faintly of vinyl and old coffee. Asher noticed it immediately. He always noticed things like that, details that suggested wear, repetition, a life lived in loops rather than upward lines. He lowered himself into the back seat carefully, setting the battered suitcase beside him. The door shut with a hollow thunk that sounded nothing like the airtight seals of his former life. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" the man asked. Asher opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The question struck him as absurd. Where did a man go when every destination he'd built himself around no longer existed? "Just drive," Asher said finally. The taxi pulled forward, tires rolling over gravel, then asphalt. The gates of the estate slid shut behind them, smooth and silent. Asher watched through the rear window as the house receded. For years, he had loved watching things from behind glass. It gave him distance, control. Now, the glass only reminded him of separation. The city lights blurred past as the taxi merged onto the highway. Asher rested his forehead against the cool window. The reflection that stared back at him looked older than he remembered. Not aged, emptied, as if something essential had been scooped out and left behind in the house on the cliff. His mind tried, again, to solve. He replayed conversations, calculated alternate choices, imagined leverage he might still possess if he made the right call, contacted the right person, said the right thing. But every path ended the same way. The trust was airtight. The data was undeniable. The children were protected. From him. For the first time, Asher confronted a possibility he had spent his entire life avoiding. There were losses that couldn't be recovered, only lived with. The taxi stopped at a red light. A homeless man stood on the median, holding a cardboard sign. The words were scrawled unevenly, letters bending under the weight of the message. Anything helps. Asher would have looked away once. Now he stared. The man's jacket was frayed, his shoes mismatched. But his eyes were alert, focused, alive. The light changed. The taxi rolled forward. Asher felt something twist in his chest. Not pity, not fear. Recognition. Status, he realized too late, had been his armor. Without it, the world didn't owe him politeness, or patience, or forgiveness. The world simply continued. The driver eventually pulled into a modest roadside motel. Neon buzzed overhead. The word vacancy flickered unevenly. "This okay?" the driver asked. Asher nodded. He paid in cash. The last of it. Inside the room, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and age. The bedspread was patterned in colors that hadn't been fashionable in decades. A small television hummed softly even before he turned it on. Asher set the suitcase on the bed and opened it. He took inventory. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, 1 sweater, a paperback book, a photo. He frowned. He didn't remember packing the photo. Sarah stood on a beach, laughing. The same picture that had once sat on his desk. The one he'd turned face down. His hands trembled as he sat on the edge of the bed, photo clutched loosely in his fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The room didn't answer. Sleep came in fragments. Asher dreamed of numbers that wouldn't settle, lines that refused to straighten, charts that bled red no matter how he adjusted the variables. He woke before dawn, heart pounding. For a moment, he reached instinctively for the bedside control panel that didn't exist. No blue light, no dashboards, just grey morning seeping through thin curtains. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, and something strange happened. He thought of Leo, not as a data set, but as a child, crouched on the floor building something crooked and proud and imperfect. He thought of Maya, humming softly, off-key, absorbed in a world that didn't care whether anyone else approved. The images hurt, which was how he knew they were real. Days passed. Then weeks. Asher learned things he'd never bothered to know before. How long it took to walk somewhere when you couldn't afford a car. Which grocery stores discounted food near closing time. How invisible a man could become without a title attached to his name. He found work eventually. Nothing impressive. Data entry. Night shifts. Temporary contracts. He didn't tell anyone who he'd been. No one asked. At first, the anonymity felt like punishment. Later, it felt like relief. One evening, Asher sat at a small desk in a rented room and began to write. "Dear Leo. Dear Maya." He stopped, crossed it out. He tried again. Words came slowly, awkwardly, without polish. He wrote about mistakes, about silence, about the difference between providing and caring. He didn't justify himself. He didn't explain. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully. Then he placed it in a drawer. He didn't send it. Some things, he understood now, were not owed a response. Spring came. Asher rented a small place farther inland. No ocean view, no sharp angles. Just a modest house with creaky floors and a porch that caught the afternoon sun. One evening, as he sat outside, a neighbor's children ran past, laughing, chasing something invisible and important only to them. Asher watched. He didn't interrupt. He simply let the sound wash over him. For the first time in years, there was no urge to measure it. Far away, on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, a house of glass still stood. Inside, 2 children grew. They learned without fear. They slept without being watched. They laughed without being evaluated. Martha kept the lavender soap. The progress portal was dismantled. The nursery light remained warm. Asher Thorne was no longer a name that moved markets. No one Googled him. No one waited for his approval. No system bent around his presence. And in the quiet, stripped of every metric he'd ever trusted, he finally understood something Sarah had known all along. You can win every game on the scoreboard and still lose everything that matters. The world didn't punish him with fire or spectacle. It punished him with distance, with time, with the slow, irreversible math of absence. What do you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments and rate the story from 0 to 10. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our stories, and don't forget to check out more touching stories by clicking here on the end screen and the playlist.